all read that? Yes. Okay, this is the earliest statement of faith that I know of, and I can't read it, but would you read it? It says, "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor." Yeah. That's a great summary of the faith of our early fathers. Now let's go to the first or the second symbol, which is that of the Star of David. And so Moses led the people out of Egypt about 1250 BCE. You have a time of the judges, the competition with the Philistines, and finally Saul becomes a king, superseded by David. And about the year 1000, David establishes Jerusalem as the center of the people of Israel. And that city became the great city in our faith, sung of yet in song. David's son is Solomon, who builds the temple, which was the holy place for the faith for ever so many years. In some ways, the temple is because of the cedars of Lebanon, which were borrowed from the Lebanese, from Lebanon area. So there we have a graphic of the temple, I believe, and of the city of Jerusalem. Of course, the kingdom falls apart with Rehoboam and Jeroboam after the time of Solomon. 10 tribes go to the north, 2 tribes stay in the south with Jerusalem, and that becomes the 10 tribes of Israel. And so what happens after they've had some years together with competition between the two, but still a part of the same religion, we have the arising of a great power in the north called Assyria. Some of you may have learned a Lord Byron poem some years ago. The Assyrian came down on the fold like a wolf on the fold, and his consorts were gleaming with silver and gold, and the sheen of their spears, like the stars of the sea, flashed on the river, on the water of old Galilee. The Assyrians under Sennacherib, that's the poem called The Destruction of Sennacherib, almost totally wiped away our ancestors in the Holy Land. 10 tribes were carried away and essentially lost, but 2 tribes remained, namely the Judah and the Benjamin tribes. And they were in Jerusalem. And so they were under Assyrian power for some time until a Mesopotamian power, Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar, threw out the Assyrians. But then we have in 586 the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And at that point, the great tragedy of our ancestors was that they were carried off out of Jerusalem and Judah to Babylon. And you may remember the song or read the words, "By the waters of Babylon." We were tormented by our captors who told us to sing the songs of Jerusalem, but how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So we hung up our harps. You got a harp there yet? Not yet. Okay. Now we got a harp? What have I got there? Nope. There's the harp that reminds us that we were in trouble. But in the year 536, a new situation arose. The Persian king, which is now, Persia is now Iran, there was a Persian king called Cyrus the Persian, who was the anointed, the new Messiah. And Cyrus said when he conquered Babylon, these people from Israel, from Jerusalem, can go home. So they went home, and there they found the temple was destroyed, the wall around the city was down, and they had to sort of make their life all together over again. So I call this period the Second Temple period, roughly 500 to the year 0, I think, BCE. During this time, they rebuild the temple and the wall and have some independence, but they are influenced greatly by the Persians. And the Persians' religion was Zoroastrianism, which is a dualistic way of viewing the world. So there's God and the devil, there's good and there's bad, there's demons and there's angels, there's belief about resurrection, which wasn't present in the Hebrew culture at that time. All of that was kind of introduced by the presence of the Persian culture, and it greatly influenced the Bible, and some of it is seen in the book of Job, where Satan appears and talks to God about, have you considered my servant Job? Now then, that particular strength of the Babylonians was done away with when Alexander the Great from Macedonia came through and conquered the world. He conquered from Greece clear out to India, around to the north of Egypt and all North Africa. And in 330, Jerusalem was in the power of the Greeks, and we have the Greek influence that was so powerful. And I just wanted to say a word about that in some ways, the Greek world, with its more philosophic language that talked about logos, sophia, spiritus, would make a huge difference, especially in the New Testament times. But it was introduced in Philo in Alexandria, would begin to make our ancestors think more deeply about what is the meaning of God and the meaning of existence. So that's one of the things that happens under the Greek influence. Now, the Greeks overplayed their hands, if you will recall. And so in the Temple of Jerusalem, which was the second temple, the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly there, and one of the rulers of the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, cleaned out the temple, put in a statue of Zeus in the temple, and it so angered our Jewish ancestors that Judas Maccabees, called the Hammerer, led a revolt that threw the Greeks out. And for about 100 years, from about 150 to 62 BCE, Israel was pretty much independent and could reestablish themselves as a people. And I want to say that it's a great strengthening that happened, and it was some ways undone in the year 62 when the Romans came into the Middle East and took Jerusalem and established their hegemony over the people of Israel. And they even put in a king whose name was Pilate, king of the Jews, and he is supposedly on the throne in Israel when a child is born in Bethlehem, or perhaps it's Nazareth where Jesus was born. But I must say that when they threw the Greeks down, the Romans entered the temple and they took out the menorah, which is a symbol of the Maccabean revolt. So the seven candelabra has been a symbol of Judaism ever since. And this is a bas relief of a Roman triumphal parade going into Rome carrying the menorah. Okay, so let's go now to the New Testament period. Do I have a lamb up there? I decided to use that as the symbol for the New Testament period because I think the resurrection really is the center of our faith. When we read everything backward from that resurrection. So you have, but in the Bible we have the birth of Jesus that's symbolized there, and Jesus becomes a teacher or a rabbi, and he has to deal with culture too, and I was kind of intrigued, if I get the next slide, I think, by what to say.
Christ and culture consider Jesus?
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, I identified it from the Bible 4 different relationships with the culture. There was on the one hand, Jesus says, "You have heard it said of old, but I say to you," about anger or about adultery or whatever it may be. So Jesus is sort of playing with the rules, with the laws, with the culture of Judaism. But he also has to do with the culture of Rome. And so he says, "Render to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God." Later on, Paul's going to say, "Be obedient to the authorities. They are for God's world good for you." And later on, Peter will say, "We must obey God rather than man." So we have all these kind of different conflicting views of how we relate to the culture that are present in the New Testament. Of course, the culmination of, what picture do I have there? All right, we have Jesus being crucified, which is part of our story and would lead us then to remember that Pentecost. Do we have a Luke 70? Do we have something? We have the Ascension, and what do I have there? Oh, okay. Let me say a little word about language. This is a very critical period for our faith. And the language of the New Testament give us many of the words that we use, like justification, sanctification, resurrection, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. All of that language comes from the New Testament. The New Testament also introduces us to people. Somebody says, "Jesus X Christ," or "Mary and Martha." How many of you in this room have biblical names? I do. Yeah. So a lot of that language of naming comes from the Bible, and the other thing that comes from the New Testament is
Names, language, roles.
And the roles that some of we still have today of priest and preacher, of pope, of metropolitan, of elder, of deacon. All of those are language words that came from the New Testament times. So now then, what do we have there, Dad? Oh, so in the book of Acts, Jesus says, "You are to be my disciples in Jerusalem, in all of Judea, in Samaria, and all the places or cultures of the world." Those were the marching orders that influenced the church in that early centuries. And so it is that Christianity spread throughout the Mediterranean world. And at that time, the Mediterranean Sea was really a Roman lake. Later it becomes a kind of a Christian lake. And that Christian lake has centers all around the Mediterranean. And I just wanted to say that from the earlier session, when the Torah began to be formed and finally evolved into what they call the Tanakh, which is both the law, the prophets, and the other writings, which is basically what's in our Older Testament. Those three things together made Judaism a religion that was of the book, and it was a portable religion, so that Judaism no longer had to have a temple or priests or be in Israel to exist. They could go out, and so they were established around the Mediterranean world, and it was especially that religion appealed to the Greco-Roman world, because I think all the old Greek and Roman gods had sort of run their course and didn't seem believable to people. So those people were called the God-fearers. And the God-fearers were especially those to whom Paul would relate to as he went out on his missionary journeys. That became then the basis of making Christianity more of a Gentile religion rather than a Jewish religion. But they also were heavily influenced, of course, by living in a Roman culture and world. Tradition has it that Peter and Paul went to Rome, and there they were under Nero's power and were led to be persecuted and died in the Roman Colosseum. Do I have that photograph? All right. And so they're there in the Colosseum with the lions. And so began a period of concentration, which began in 62 or 63 or 4 under Nero, and continued somewhat into the close of the New Testament canon with the book of Revelation. Which said, behold, I make all things new. I'm going to come back to that later. Now let's go to the next section. Under persecution, that lasted a couple of hundred years. Christians were persecuted because they were a new religion. Jews were not persecuted because they were an old religion. So Christianity was really struggled to find itself in the world, and often, but periodically and in different places around the Mediterranean, they were persecuted. But in the year 312, a Roman soldier general named Constantine came into conflict with his rival, and they fought in Rome, in Italy, and he crossed the Milvian Bridge. And in crossing the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a vision of Christ, or X, which is chi, and rho, which is a kind of a P, put together into a symbol that he put on the shields of all his army, and he was victorious. Constantine's mother was a Christian, and so he issued the Edict of Toleration. So for the first time in about the year 313, Christians began to be tolerated in the empire, and the tables began to turn for them. Constantine did a couple of other significant things. He moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, which had been Byzantium, and he also called together councils of the church of Nicaea and Chalcedon and others. And those councils helped form the faith, articulate for the faith what we believe. And I bet you if I start this, some of you will be able to say with me, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, who was born of Jesus Christ, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, Okay. So anyway, those creeds, Nicaea became a fuller apostles' creed, as was Chalcedon, which talked about the nature of Christ being holy God, holy man, and we've been arguing about this for years. Not everybody agreed with the decisions made at Nicaea. Some of the people had other points of view, like a guy named Arius. And Arius had great influence, especially across the Danube and the Rhine rivers with the barbarian cultures. And they're knocking at the door. But during this time of before 500 of the Common Era, you also get a response of, well, I'm going to back up a minute. The barbarians are at the gate. Do I have that at all? What do I have there? There they are. And The year 406 CE is very important because the Rhine and the Danube rivers freeze over. And with the freezing over, it meant that the barbarian tribes could come in to the Roman Empire, and they did. And by 410, they had sacked Rome, and actually when we were sent, finally, they migrated out to Spain and became a kind of a minority Christian barbarian culture in Spain. But they were there for a while and influenced in a number of ways, like belief with stronger marriages was part of the barbarian culture as distinct from the Roman culture. So the barbarians came into the culture and dominated for some years, but now the culture has moved mostly to the east, to Constantinople, which is the new capital that Constantine put up, and you have the Byzantium Empire.
Talk about the C's, the 5 C's.
Okay, so after the council, there's a great argument among the great apostles, bishops of the church. The bishops are located in 5 different places in particular. One is in Rome on the left of your screen. The other, more in the middle, is Constantinople, at Antioch, in Jerusalem, and in Alexandria. Those are all great centers of Christian learning and stayed so for a long time. But finally, we're going to get some real trouble in the empire because in 615, Muhammad goes to Medina, and by the end of the century, the Muslims have run over most of the Middle East, over the North Africa, and into Spain. And that becomes a diminution of all the Christianity to the east except in Constantinople and in Rome. So they'll be in tension for a long time. The Muslims did not persecute Christians, but they did tax them. So Christianity began to be attenuated under Muslim rule. What have I got, Deb? Okay, one of the other responses I meant to mention is that because Christianity became identified with the Roman Empire and the culture of Rome, many Christians said, we don't want to be a part of that culture, and so they took to the desert, and Anthony of the desert was one of the people that fled. So you get a whole new formation of Christianity for the next 500 years, which I call the age of monasticism. Is that it? Yep. All right. The symbol there on your piece of paper shows a kind of a strange bird. That's called a wild goose. And it's a Celtic symbol. And I'm reminded by it that Christianity then spread out in a number of ways. Some of you may have read the book, How the Irish Saved Western Civilization. Yes? Okay. So the Irish, or Columba, took on a ship over to Scotland and introduced Irish Christianity to the Scots. He went into the lowlands. He went into Europe. He went into Russia, or they went into Russia. They even went into North Africa. That was one thrust. From the south, the Pope sent Augustine, a different Augustine, called Augustine of Canterbury, to England and reestablished Christianity there. The Benedictines monks went into the lowlands of Phrygia. And do I have a picture of Boniface cutting down the tree of oak of or? Maybe we don't have that photograph. Anyway, that was the entry into the Northland to Germany, and from Germany it then went on to the Scandinavian countries by the end of the century, where the Vikings appeared. Another thrust was from Constantinople, the Tsarina in Kiev, now we call it Ukraine, asked for a witness from the Christians in Constantinople, and the emperor sent Cyril and Methodius to Kiev and introduced Christianity there. Cyrillic language, whatever it is. Cyrillic comes from Cyril having gone there, and that was about 888 of the Common Era. And within a couple of centuries, Christianity had spread north to Moscow, to Novgorod, and made Russian Orthodoxy so big. I think that Orthodoxy is the third largest religion in the world, or Christian religion, after Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodoxy. They can actually be the second largest. And finally, another group of Christians went out of the Roman Empire into the Persian Empire, and one of the people that took it there was Nestorius, and he established the Church of the East, which still exists today. But at one time, the Church of the East, or the Nestorians, swept everywhere from essentially Syria to China. It was the largest empire ever held by any Christian group, and that was the Nestorian. But they were outside the empire of Rome. Now, to continue, I think, have we got a picture of Benedict? Benedict was a monk in Italy, and he introduced an order of monks, the Benedictines, which kind of superseded the Augustine, the order of Augustine, and they all lived by the idea of ora et labora, pray and work. And they performed husbandry of the land and of animals, and they copied manuscripts which really saved ancient culture for the West by what they did. The monks were very important in the whole history of the West. Now I want to say about one of the things that happened, which was of significance in the year 800, the Frankish king, who was named Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, goes to Rome. There's very much of an alliance between the French and the Italians, or Rome and Aachen in France or Germany. And he goes to Rome on Christmas, and the Pope puts a crown on his head, and he becomes the king of the Franks by papal decree, and so began the Holy Roman Empire. And that's how that began. And we have with that, again, a renewal of what is called Caesaropapism. Caesaropapism essentially began when Constantine adopted Christianity, so that Caesar and the Pope become united, and that's going to become an alliance of church and state that is going to prevail for over 1,500 years. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. But Charlemagne also made that alliance of Caesaropapism for the Holy Roman Empire, and that becomes terribly important. Now, I think I've already talked to, what have we got there? Have I talked about Muhammad? All right, so in the year 615, he rides out of the desert and conquers all of the west out to North Africa, into Spain, and east and as far as up into Turkey. But Constantinople never falls, but the strength of Christianity in the Middle East that had been there for so many centuries is lost. So you have then the center of Rome and Constantinople as being the places. I think I want to move to the next section.
About schism?
Okay. Constantinople, and Rome, one has a patriarch, the other has a pope. they are not very close to one another. One's a Greek culture, one's a Roman culture. In the year 1055, I think it is, there's the Great Schism. They heal mutual anathemas. In other words, go to hell to one another. and so Christendom was radically split between the East and the West, Orthodox and Catholics, Greeks and Romans. Now then, at this point, who is that? Okay. All right. And I'm going to say at the year 1000, after that great split, we began to have what I call a period of feudalism and also of high Christendom. If ever there was a time when Christ was over culture, it was during that 500-year period between 1000 and 1500 BCE, CE. And the popes were in many ways able, being free of the empire which was in Constantinople, to exercise authority in the West, and especially over the Franks or the French. And so there's always a great competition. And I love the symbol that Henry IV said, I want to appoint the next bishop for Paris. And the Pope said, no, you can't do that. I am the one that makes the appointments. And Henry IV said, no, I'm going to make them. So the Pope said, well, then I'm going to tell my priests that they can't baptize, they can't give communion, they can't bury the dead. And finally, Henry says, that's such a threat to my people, I'm going to go apologize to the Pope. And so he crosses the Alps and waits in the snows at Canossa for 3 days before the Pope will let him in. And there he recants and says, I'm sorry, and he's forgiven. So that tension goes on. But all through these years, there's this rival between monarchs and the papacy. We have 10 minutes. We're going to have to go fast. Okay. During this period, after about 1100, the Knight Templars and the Holy Crusades happened to the west, to the east, trying to recapture the Holy Lands. They do not succeed at it, but the Pope still stays strong, will issue at the Fourth Lateran Council the bull of Unum Sanctum, which proclaims the supremacy of the papacy, that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. And so they have terrible power. But the French kings actually take the Pope and move him to Avignon in France. So there's 60 years of the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. The papacy does fall into bad hands, and so that there's indulgences being sold to get out of hell, free cards if you pay enough money. Now, why they had to raise so much money? Because they had to pay for the art that Michelangelo had in the cathedral in Rome, in St. Peter's. All right, now there happens to be a bull that arises. What do we got?
Francis?
Oh, I do want to say that during the popes, they had authorized the Franciscans as a holy order, which comes the closest there ever came to having a new Jesus in Francis. And he does the prayer, make me an instrument of your peace. Or he says those famous words, preach constantly, use words if necessary. I always like that. He also established the Dominicans, and one of the Dominicans was Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa Theologica, talked about the proofs for the existence of God, talked about God as the first cause or the unmoved mover. And at the same time, there was this great piety by Thomas à Kempis, who was a monk in the lowlands, I think in Phrygia. He wrote a book called The Imitation of Christ. It's the second best-selling Christian book in the history of the world, which he talks about following the imitation of Christ. Well, in reaction to the indulgences and the corruption of the papacy, A bull of a man arose in Germany, said, I will have nothing of that. And that person is Luther.
Yep.
And Luther develops a different interpretation, much stronger on justification by faith rather than works, which is prevalent in Roman culture. And he comes in conflict with Rome. Eventually, he says to the council that's called against him with the Emperor Charles V in presence, they tell him to recant. He says, I will not recant unless I'm convinced by reason and scripture that I'm wrong. But if not, then here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. So Lutheranism is born. And I would have you know that shortly thereafter, 4 major branches of Protestantism arose. Lutheranism in Germany, Reformed tradition in Switzerland at Geneva, which is led by John Calvin, which becomes Presbyterianism in Scotland, Puritanism in England, and becomes what we know the Puritans and Pilgrims in America. The third branch of the Anabaptists, which went to the lowlands, which had greater sense of separation of church and state, individual conscience, baptism only of adults, and much pacifism. So they were radical reformers, and they often were persecuted. And the fourth major branch was the Anglican branch when Henry IV said, I want to have my marriage annulled. And so those branches take place. We lose our screen. Yeah. Okay.
We're back. Okay. You want to go to the ecumenical age? Or do you want to talk about Columbus?
Well, I call this era where the Luther and others arrive a nautical national age. And the nauticalism is the sense that the world is now afloat, and the Portuguese and the Spanish are competing in the Atlantic. The Pope draws a line down the middle of the Atlantic saying everything east of there can go to the Portuguese, everything west can go to the Spanish, and that's South America, Central America, North America. So that's a very important distinction that happens. And of course, in America, we meet the Native American culture, which is practically destroyed by the immigration of the English and the Germans and others that come in there. But I just wanted to have you remember the name of Bartholomew de las Casas, who protested the treatment of the Indians. And so they were never made slaves. But on the other hand, it opened the doors for slavery that the Dutch and the British started importing to the New World. And that's a whole other problem that maybe David Booth will talk about some ways next week in American culture and racism. I guess we better move to the last section, and then I'm going to stop. The scientific age, sort of 1660, when Newton sat under an apple tree, saw apple drop by tradition, made the discovery of gravity, and the whole scientific world began with the age of the Enlightenment, with all the great thinkers that have influenced us to this very day, including the great, what one church historian calls the bearded God killers, Marx, Darwin, and Freud. There was response made to that through the years, I know, and which we're still responding to. And I need to wrap this up, Deb. A pathogen? What's a pathogen? Oh, Caesaropapism. Thank you. I do want to lift that up because I think it's terribly important in terms of this lecture on culture and Christianity. In 1797, when the Constitution was born and the Bill of Rights was adopted, there was the first time a separation of church and state in the world. That's the first time that Caesaropapism is broken. The second time is by Napoleon, who breaks it for the Holy Roman Empire with Catholicism. The third time is in 1917, just a little over a century ago, at the end of World War I, where the Axis powers were defeated. So there was a disestablishment of religion, of Lutheranism in Prussia for the Germans. There was a disestablishment in Hungary, Austria, which is the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. And there was a disestablishment of the Ottoman Empire with their defeat after World War I. So that's kind of the end of Caesaropapism, although, as Deborah and I were talking about the other day, there are certain groups in America that want to bring back American nationalism and have a new reunion of church and state.
WCC?
The World Council of Churches emerged, and that's why I called in my book this called the ecumenical global age. I'm not so sure that the unity of Christians has come together, but there has been a great movement of the spirits that has crossed the world. In some ways, as Philip Jenkins, a church historian, says, the great threat to the world is not Islam. It may be Southern Christianity, which has a very different take on things than Northern Christianity, liberal Christianity.
Movements?
What have we got?
Movements?
I won't talk about that.
Isms?
And I just want to say that in the last century, of course, we had the movements of communism with religion called opiate to the people. We have fascism with Heil Hitler. We have, in most recent years, Americanism with its exceptionalism, which is also a danger to the world. We don't know where the world is going to go. There's good hope in the movement, perhaps, for saving the environment, but it may not happen. And our beautiful blue earth may be destroyed, or it may be destroyed by an atom bomb. But our hope as Christians is always, if I can have the last slide, maybe. Oh, that's the last slide. Well, the last slide or words that I would say are simply the words from the book of Revelation. Behold, I make all things new. Or in terms of culture, there's a great hymn that I love that says, oh, where are kings and empires now, of old that went and came? But Lord, thy church is praying yet 1,000 years the same. Well, maybe the same, but also different, but still praying, and we'll continue that we shall be able to do so. Thank you very much.